Hello, beautiful people. My guest today is Rob Henderson. And Rob has, from my perspective, the most unique insight into class in the United States. Just to give you a quick backstory, he grew up in one of the poorest towns in California, and eventually he joined the Air Force. Later, he went to Yale, and he currently is a doctoral candidate in psychology at Cambridge. So with all that being said, he's written in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and he's got a huge wealth of experience on psychology. In this conversation, we went deep on Rob's story, and afterwards he told me that some of the questions asked were things that he had never considered or been asked before. So I think this will be a really interesting conversation if you've had some previous reference to Rob's work. But if you haven't, this will also be extremely fascinating, is my guess. If you enjoyed this episode, or if you didn't, let me know on Twitter your thoughts. Hey Danny Miranda is the best place to give me feedback for the conversation, and I look forward to hearing from you. But without further ado, this is my conversation with Rob Henderson.
Interesting people, thought-provoking conversations, nutrition for your brain. Journey through the minds of the world's top performers and discover what it really takes to achieve your highest version. This is the Danny Miranda Podcast.
Why don't we start off with talking about a little bit about your story and your background, because diving into it, I was just blown away, and I would love for you to expand on that to start things off.
Yeah. Thanks, Danny. It's great to be here. I can just give you the sort of cliff notes, and if you want to dive into any of it further, I'm happy to. But at the moment, I'm a PhD student here at the University of Cambridge in England. But my sort of path to higher education was very sort of winding and indirect. And so to just back way up to the beginning, I was born into poverty in Los Angeles to my mother, who was an immigrant from South Korea. And she was unable to care for me because she had gotten addicted to drugs and was just generally, not in the condition to be a parent. So I spent my early years living in foster homes in LA. Later was adopted by this sort of working class couple in a small-ish Northern California town called Red Bluff, which is, at the time, as a kid growing up there, sort of like middle childhood to adolescence in Red Bluff, after I left the foster homes in LA, I thought of Red Bluff as like a pretty safe-ish town, simply because it seemed, I guess it was just more familiar. I knew the people there. It was just a slightly more cohesive community. But it turns out that Red Bluff is either the third or the fourth most dangerous city in California. And, when I think back to the kind of stuff that I saw and the kind of people I knew, it kind of makes sense. There were a lot of drugs. There was a lot of crime, a lot of violence. I mean, just one example, one of my good friends in school, his little brother tried to join a gang. And during a gang initiation process, he was killed playing Russian roulette. And, there was a cop that I knew from my town. He was just like pumping gas in his car at a gas station. And some dude just came up right behind him while he was pumping gas into his cop car and shot him in the head. And these weren't these were sort of unusual stories, but they weren't crazy. So this town was like a little bit, it was just unsafe. My own personal life was also not ideal for a child. My adoptive parents divorced, and my mother subsequently fell in love with a woman. And so together they raised me into sort of my high school, teenage years. But then my mom's partner, who was sort of like a pseudo quasi parent for me, she was shot. And so that was just like yet another I guess, sort of another moment of drama or chaos or whatever, a sort of setback for me. Throughout all of this stuff that was going on in my life, I was a terrible student. I pretty much did just enough to get by, sort of get that like C- average in school. And then, yeah, so toward the end of high school, as I was about to graduate, I decided to join the military. So I was 17, joined the Air Force, went on a couple of deployments. You and I were talking earlier. That's when I was stationed in Germany. And yeah, as my enlistment was winding down, I started taking night classes, took the SAT, which I never took in high school. And yeah, generally sort of like prepared a decent application and got into Yale, where I attended undergrad on the GI Bill. And yeah, from there I came here to Cambridge for my PhD. So that is like a very sweeping overview of my life. But yeah, we can talk more about any of that if you like.
Dude, there's so much to unpack there, and I can't wait to unpack it. One of my first questions I have about that is, what? So you must have assumed that life was normal, did you not? Like you grew up in this place in California that was the third or fourth most dangerous city in the country, and you just assumed that was the way everyone lived. Take us through there.
Yeah, man. I mean, it was weird because, like I said, we sort of knew everyone in the town. Like I sort of knew, my friends. The town wasn't that big. It was about, at that point, it's a little bigger now, but I think back then it was like 15,000 people, 13,000 people, right around there. The median income of Red Bluff at that time was, this is median household income, $27,000 a year. I think the poverty rate in the U.S. as a whole was something like 11%, but in Red Bluff, it was somewhere between 20 and 30%. So it was, sort of a poor, rundown town. Whatever. It's like mostly like working class, white and Hispanic people. Yeah, man, there was a lot of meth, a lot of like prescription drugs, homeless people sort of wandering around. Yeah, it was really just like not a safe place. I think so. This was fairly recent, but I remember there used to be these apps. I don't know if they still exist, where you could sort of like track, who, like, I guess, registered sexual offenders in your local area on your phone. And I remember I was in Red Bluff. This was a few years ago with my sister, and she had that app, and she pulled it up, and there were like a lot of people in that town who had records. So yeah, man, it was just it was rough. A lot of fights in school. Really easy to get your hands on drugs if you needed to. It was a bad spot for kids.
Another thing that you brought up was that you said you weren't smart, or that you got, C's in school. And this seems so odd to me because I've read your stuff, and you clearly seem like a bright individual. You seem like you're smart. What happened, like, to get you on a different path?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about too. Just I've always been a curious kid. I mean, like as a kid, I've always been a curious person, but as a kid specifically, I did read a lot. I was sort of interested in things. I would check out books at the library, like the school library, just on my own. I'd stop by, pick up some books on the way home or whatever. I'd ask to borrow books from my teachers. And yeah, I mean, in that sense, I enjoyed learning, but I didn't like the structured learning of school. Probably as a result of some of my early experiences, I had a sort of chip on my shoulder about adults telling me what to do. I really didn't respect adults very much. And so when they would want me to do homework or pay attention in class, I sort of took that as an opportunity to, be a class clown or goof off, or, I never did homework. I didn't do any like the whatever projects or like, building a volcano for science class or whatever. I never did any of that. So it was, just in terms of the structured learning, but personally, I was, maybe a kind of smart kid, and one way I learned this, I guess, was, even though I'd always aimed for, just barely passing grades, when I took the ASVAB, which was a standardized test for the military, so sort of equivalent to the SAT, in that you have to sort of reach a certain threshold before they let you in. I scored, very high on that. And, the recruiter was telling me, this is a really high score and you qualify for, every job in the Air Force and so on. And I thought to myself, like, that's surprising because, I just didn't pay much attention in class. I would read the textbooks, actually. I'd read the textbooks. I would read the sort of assignments, but I just wouldn't do them. And part of that was this sort of rebellious thing that I had going on when I was younger.
Why did you decide to join the military?
There were a couple of different reasons. So one reason was to just get out of that town and to get away from the sort of the tumult and the drama of my early life. And so for kids from Red Bluff, really the only way you get out of a town like that is either you go to college, like far away, or you join the military. And I could sense, even as a 16, 17-year-old kid, when I started thinking about what to do next, I sensed, that if I stayed, I was sort of on a bad trajectory. In high school, I had part-time jobs. I worked as a dishwasher at an Italian restaurant. I worked as a clerk at a grocery store. I had older coworkers in their early to mid-20s, some of them a little older. And I could see that, like, that could be my life when I'm, 26. I could still be doing this. When I'm 36, I might still be, I could follow the path of these, these colleagues of mine. And I knew I didn't want to do that. So the military, I saw it as sort of like an exit or an ejection button or something to just like blast me out of there. I had some other reasons too. That time, it was the later 2000s. So we had a couple of different wars going on. I found that interesting. I was curious about that too. And I thought the military would sort of bring me closer to what was going on in the Middle East. There was like a sort of background patriotism, like this sort of low level of patriotism radiating throughout the little town that I was in. And the third reason is that a lot of people didn't want me to. And so that made me want to do it even more. I would tell teachers or like my, friends of my mom, and they would say like, are you crazy? Like, that we have, there's, George Bush is crazy, and we have, these wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, and every day more troops are dying. You should definitely not do this. And I thought like, well, now I'm definitely doing it. So there was like a few different mixed motivations there.
You mentioned before that you didn't trust adults or you look down upon them. And I'm curious why that is. Where did that belief come from?
Yeah, I don't think it was ever a sort of conscious thought that, adults are untrustworthy and I should be sort of wary. I think it was just over time I gradually experienced enough betrayals. I mentioned before that my mother wasn't able to care for me, my birth mother, but my father, I never met him. I don't know who he is. So, between that and then my birth mother, when my adoptive parents split later, my adoptive father sort of cut off contact with me. Not to mention all the foster homes I had lived in too. I'd stay with a home for, 5 months or 8 months and then move on. So I lived in 7 different foster homes as a kid. So I just sort of didn't really think of adults as a permanent or stable source of, care or advice or anything. I thought they were just sort of there. They would sort of say that there were these rules and that you had to follow them. And like, to me, that was like, okay, I would follow them as best I could without getting caught breaking them. Like I would do my best to give the appearance of following them just because I didn't want to get in trouble or whatever. So that was sort of where my mind was at this point. There was a very brief period, I've written about this too. My mother and her partner Shelley, they were, sort of stable parents to me, from like age 10-ish to like 14. And that is a period where I sort of recall a feeling of security and stability. And, during that time, that was probably like when my grades were the best and when I felt that I was actually part of a cohesive family. But it was very, I don't know, it was not built on a solid foundation because of all the experience I had had in my early childhood. So as soon as, Shelley was shot and that, the tragedy of that sort of reverberated throughout the family and all of the aftermath of what had happened there, sort of emotionally and financially and everything else, that sort of resurfaced all of those sort of suspicious feelings I'd had about authority and about adults. So yeah, it was a few different things, but definitely that sense of adults are sort of not permanent features of my world. That's how I was thinking back then.
What does that level of, you just described so many situations which might be hard for people who I'm sitting here and I cannot imagine going through all of what you've gone through in the first 15 years of your life, in my entire life. It just sounds so, it sounds like it could have potentially caused you to just have a feeling about the world that would lead you to a place that wasn't Yale, that wasn't, writing what you're doing and putting yourself out there. Why did you, what do you think all that tumultuousness did to your psyche, and how did you overcome it, or how do you try to overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would just say that, like, I think a lot of people are stronger than they think, and they can, you'd be surprised what you can undergo and withstand and sort of find ways to be okay. We all find ways to sort of adapt. I mean, as a kid, one thing that I did to sort of soothe myself or sort of, forget what was going on was, like I said, through reading. So I would read books. I would read, one thing that I did was, and this was like sort of middle school, high school, I would read memoirs and biographies of people who had had tough lives. And at the time, like, if you had asked me, why are you reading these books? I would have just said, like, oh, they're interesting or whatever. But I think one thing I was doing, I was reading books like, what's the name of it? So there was a book called Black Boy by Richard Wright about, Richard Wright, who experienced, terrible racism and just had like a really hard life in the early 20th century. And this is, sort of chronicles what that was like for him. I read a book. I can't remember the name of it. I think the author's name was Jade something or other, but she was a Chinese American woman around like the early 20th century, late 19th century, who was a prostitute in San Francisco. And I mean, she'd had, incredible hardship in her life. And so I was reading these books at the time, just reading them, not knowing why. But I think what I was doing was sort of trying to figure out how other people coped with hardship, or just like knowing that people could cope with hardship and be okay. So that was one thing I did. And it wasn't just those kinds of books. I would read other books, more sort of uplifting books. This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff, and, other kinds of books too. I would get into trouble with my friends. I mean, especially like in the high school years, just sort of getting into fights or smoking weed or like whatever, drinking and driving, doing a bunch of dumb stuff, ditching class. Another thing was, maybe this is like sort of a healthier outlet, was lifting weights. I got really into fitness toward the end of high school. Part of that was sort of preparing for the military, but also just as like uh, putting myself through tough physical burdens, because that sort of takes your mind off of where you are and what you're doing when you're under a lot of physical stress, like squatting. I don't know if you've ever like squat a lot of weight, but like you don't think about anything else when you're doing that. So there were a few different sort of ways I managed to cope with it. Later on, I started to write and to process and do those kinds of things as well. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to know for sure, though, what specifically helped the most and what I was doing as just like an attempt to feel better, and maybe it wasn't so effective.
Yeah, I remember reading, I don't know if this is true, but I remember reading that half of U.S. presidents had a parent die before 18. And if it is true, it just goes to show that people can transform themselves from awful situations happening to them. So you brought up writing as an outlet, and I'm so glad you did, because your writing has been something that I've enjoyed. I subscribe to your newsletter, love it, really always get something out of it. Recommend everyone listening to check it out as well, and it'll be in the show notes. But talk to me about how writing has influenced your life, and when did you start writing, at least like for publications or for yourself? When did you start releasing your writing? Talk to me about your writing.
Yeah, one thing that I did when I was a kid, I would sort of like just write down ideas or like short stories. I don't have any of these files still. Like this is like on an old family, like a Gateway computer from 2003. I mean, I have no idea where any of this is. I'd be curious to know, like, to have a look at it, but I don't think I ever will. But I was always interested, in reading. I would write things down. When I had to write essays in class, that was one of the things that I tended to enjoy more than the other kinds of assignments anyway. But it wasn't really until, and I don't know, like early 20s or something, when I started thinking about writing more seriously. When I applied to college, I had to write essays, like personal statements, right? For the Common App, for different universities, they require a sort of personal statement why you want to go to this college or whatever. Yale had 2 of these essays, and so I was thinking, just sort of reflecting on my life, and I finally started just like diving deep into it, and trying to tell the story without feeling any kind of, trying not to let self-consciousness get the better of me, and to just be honest about it. So that was probably where it started, like when I started writing at least about my own life. But then, so in preparation for college, I had attended this program called the Warrior Scholar Project, which is, they advertise it as a boot camp academic boot camp for veterans to help them prepare for college. I went to this thing, and while I was there, I befriended some people and met some interesting people, added them on Facebook. And so, as I was applying for college months later, one of these people that I had met posted this ad from the New York Times, and it was something like, we're looking for interesting college essays about social class, something like that. And I clicked on it, and and I'm clicking on this, by the way, as someone who didn't read the New York Times. I wasn't like into news. I wasn't just caught up in media in general. This was 2014, 2015. I just wasn't like a person who read these kinds of articles, whether it be the New York Times or Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, these kinds of publications. So I'm clicking this totally as an outsider, a noob, or whatever. And I think to myself, well, I wrote this essay about my life for college. Maybe it's interesting. If nothing else, like, why not? It costs literally nothing to just send this. So I did. And yeah, like a couple weeks later, they got back to me and said, this is a really interesting essay, and they ran it. and it got like a ton of interesting feedback from people. And so that was like one inkling I had that, oh, like my life is pretty unique to a large swath of the country. Because to me, my life was sort of, I mean, I knew that it was a little bit different, but in comparison to the friends that I grew up with, the guys around me, it wasn't that different. I mean, you know, my friends, they didn't live in a bunch of different foster homes and go through everything that I went through, but, you know, they were sort of like low income, rough lives, divorced parents or you know, parents never married. Just they'd experienced a lot of hardship themselves. So none of them ever said like, wow, Rob, you have this amazing story. But I did hear that a lot from people who, you know, read that article in the New York Times, that essay. Later, when I got to undergrad, started writing more, finding that I really enjoyed it a lot. And yeah, I've written other pieces since then for, you know, from the New York Times and other publications. And I just find it interesting how people resonate with, you know, when I talk about my life or just talk about ideas too. I mean, I read a lot and, you know, try to share the stuff that I'm generally interested in terms of psychology and so on.
Yeah. And what's so interesting to me about you is that it feels like, from my perspective, that you've spent time in low income environments, middle class income environments with the military, and higher income environments with Yale, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, one of the realizations I had was that I sort of, you know, incrementally, sort of, you know, step by step, moved along at least like the major, you know, rungs on the socioeconomic ladder. You know, sort of started out, you know, about as poor as you can be in a Western country, in an American context. And yeah, sort of lived in a more working class environment, military. You know, I know there's some misconceptions some people have about the military, but it's actually quite a middle class organization. Recruits tend to come from sort of, yeah, middle class families, middle income. And then, yeah, from there, yeah, went to college, and it was sort of, yeah, much more affluent people around me.
So from this, I assume that you've created this thesis almost of luxury beliefs. And I'm super curious for you to explain what luxury beliefs are to people listening, and just riff on that for a bit.
Yeah. So luxury beliefs, well, so okay, I'll define it first, just so that people have some context. So luxury beliefs I define as, you know, opinions and ideas that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower class. And so how did I come up with this? Well, there are a couple of different lines of evidence and observation that led me to this. So the first is that, you know, people used to display their social class through their material goods. To some extent, they still do, but I think it used to be much more prevalent in the past. So if you read books from sociologists like Thorstein Veblen or the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, they basically observed that, you know, the upper classes, you know, they would wear tuxedos and have, you know, a pocket watch and a monocle, and, you know, they'd have butlers, they would have, you know, their own drivers. There was this sort of material indicators of one's position in society. My claim is that, you know, material goods are becoming more detached from social class today, for a variety of reasons. One reason that I point out in my essays about luxury beliefs is that, you know, material goods are just more affordable. Just, you know, sort of the observation you made about, you know, the people that I had grown up with and sort of the steps that I had made along the way. You know, all of my friends from high school have iPhones, and all of my friends from college have the same kind of iPhone. Maybe slightly more updated model, but you wouldn't really be able to tell unless you sort of got up close. Another thing is that, at least among the more affluent, it seems like it's hard to tell, right? Like if you just sort of like walked around a major city, I'm not sure you'd be able to tell right away, at least, who has money and who doesn't. I think it would be very clear who's really rich and who's really poor, but upper middle class people and working class people, they don't look that different anymore in terms of the clothes they wear. I think affluent people like to sort of downplay their own class, their own positioning. I mean, you see, rich guys like Mark Cuban wearing cargo shorts and flip-flops, Zuckerberg with his hoodie. Rich guys don't look like rich guys anymore. So that's one. And so people still want to display their class in society in some way. And one way that you can do this is with your ideas and opinions, with your luxury beliefs. So, if there is a sort of conventional opinion that a typical person has, one way for you to indicate that you are not, working class or middle class or, conventional is to have a different opinion, to sort of signal that like, oh, I'm not one of those people. I went to a fancy college and, my way of expressing this is to tell you, my provocative or interesting or, unusual perspective on whatever social or political issue, it happens to be. So that's, people want to display their class. Today they do it with beliefs. And the other piece to this is that the upper class, so some people might say, well, why do the upper class even care about this? Like, do they really express different beliefs? Why do they even care about, or is it true that they even care about expressing their higher position in society? And the answer is that they do. So there have been some interesting studies, social psychology studies on people, like how much people care about their social status. And so I think it might be, maybe intuitive to think that people who are particularly lower on the sort of status spectrum in society, maybe people who don't have especially prestigious jobs or high income, those would be the people who care the most about, protecting or increasing their status. But that's not the case. Research suggests that it's actually high status people who care the most about status. So there's a positive correlation between your current social status in society and how much you care about status, how much you want to protect and increase it. And so it's actually, if you just want to look at, young people, for example, people at Ivy League schools care way, way more about status than, people at maybe like a community college or people who are working or something like that. So they care a lot about status, and because the norms have shifted such that they can't express it with material goods, fortunately, there's this other route, what I call luxury beliefs. Now they can still express their status that they care so much about in a more socially acceptable way.
So what are some examples of these luxury beliefs?
Yeah, so I think, there are a few. One is the belief that all families are the same. I tell this story in one of my luxury belief essays. I think this one, it was either in Quillette or the New York Post, but essentially one of my old classmates from Yale, we were talking about, career and family and so on, and she told me that she thought that monogamy was outdated or that, expired or something along those lines, that like monogamy is the past and in the future, maybe it's better to have some other kind of relationship structures. But, when I sort of think about her and her life, she came from an affluent family. She works at a pretty, like a prestigious tech company. And so I asked her, well, what about you? Are you going to be monogamous? Are you going to live in a polycule? Like, what's your plan? And she said, no, I'm probably later on going to find a husband, settle down. Like, I'll probably do something like that. But, that doesn't have to be for everyone. Like, even though I want to do that, it's still like, I just don't like monogamy as like something that people should adhere to, even though she herself planned to. And if you ask a lot of people at, or top graduates of, top universities, that kind of mindset is not uncommon, that, oh, monogamy is outdated, or like, marriage is this sort of old oppressive structure, and, people should be able to, do other things. But then when you look at what they actually do in their own lives, they have a little bit of fun in college, maybe early adulthood as young professionals, get on the dating apps or whatever. But later on, they tend to find a partner, settle down, have kids, like live this sort of very traditional life. And so the luxury belief here is spreading, like broadcasting the belief that monogamy is outdated. You don't need to do that anymore. It's, it's oppressive and so on. And then what do they do in their own personal lives? They still do those same things. But we have to remember that, highly educated people wield disproportionate influence in society. So, of course, they influence, policy, government policy, marriage policy, and so on. But they also influence sort of culture at large. So they tend to be more likely to be writers for television. They tend to, just have a little bit more influence in the media. Maybe they make podcasts. They sort of have this outsized influence in society. And so they have a platform to share ideas, and they do over time sort of spread to other people. So yeah, monogamy as an outdated idea, that's one big luxury belief.
You mentioned before that people or students at Yale are much more concerned with status than those who go to community college. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that people who go to Yale care a lot more about their status?
Well, so one thing is, I think that for a lot of these students, that drive, that desire for high status, that's how they got to that position in the first place. You don't get into, this kind of school unless you are incredibly driven, by and large. There are some kinds of, exceptions here and there, but by and large, the way you get into a top university is to just work your ass off. Straight A's aren't enough, right? Like, you have to do all these extracurriculars. You have to be at the top of your class and do all these other things and have a really impressive story. And, you just have to be that kind of person. So they sort of select for status anxious people, people who are very preoccupied with climbing upwards. But one thing that I think exacerbates this, sort of adds fuel to the fire of, trying to climb up, is that they're around people just like them. And so even if you start out as like, oh, I care a little bit about status and sort of like making my way in the world, when you're around a bunch of other super smart, super driven people, you can't help but get swept up in that sort of mindset. Like, you've probably heard that phrase, you are the average of the 5 people you're around the most, or something like that. I mean, there's some truth to that. There's some interesting research, for example. I think this is from Nicholas Christakis, who's a physician and sociologist at Yale. He found that things like obesity can be socially contagious, such that, I can't remember the specifics of this, but if you have an obese friend, like, not only are you more likely to be obese, but your friend who has no contact with your obese friend is more likely to be obese. So it actually sort of, like, that's how sort of, quote, contagious it can be, right? And so when you're around certain kinds of people, that just rubs off on you and can influence your decisions even more. And even I, as an older person, sort of felt that, like, even though I was a little bit more established in my identity and my habits and what I wanted to do with my life, even I sort of picked up on this like energy that vibrated throughout campus of these, incredibly driven students who were, very, very aware of their sort of social rank.
That research that you touched on, I want to underscore for everyone listening. What the research found was that if you become obese, your friend's friend, the third person has some chance or an increased likelihood of becoming obese, which
right. I don't know.
blew my mind.
I'm not really sure the actual like the specifics or how strong the effect is, but it was statistically significant.
Right.
It was enough to matter.
And it held true for happiness, I believe, as well. Like if you randomly become happy, it also makes your friend's friend. There's a percentage increase in the likelihood they become happy, as well as smoking if you start smoking. And it really goes to point out how intertwined we all are, and how, you know, you think of yourself maybe as just this person who's isolated, who only has what you do only affects you. But the truth is that what you do affects so many other people surrounding you and your environment as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, so another way to think about this, if you are an incredibly driven person, not only will your friends pick up on that, but, so will the other people that they know. And so when you put a bunch of these people together, furthermore, I mean, there are a lot of factors here, but another factor is, you're sort of, there are opportunities everywhere, and you sort of are like, there's this like constant low level reminder that like, you better not miss out on the opportunities here. So there's a lot going on there. But yeah, I definitely think that, basically that drive of like, distinguishing yourself in some way, but in a way that's socially acceptable. Remember, I think that a lot of these, these highly educated people, they have this sort of egalitarian concern. And so, it's just not cool to like, I mean, there's even like a little bit of, sort of looking down upon or frowning upon expressing wealth through material goods. They consider it to be, like kind of vulgar, but a very good way to sort of indicate it is, your class without the material goods is through your opinions and your beliefs and the kinds of the way that you speak, the way that you interact, habits, mannerisms. There's a lot that goes into this, and again, like I draw heavily from sociologists who've come before me. So yeah.
Do you think that luxury beliefs are conscious? Do you think that people who are of a higher status or higher socioeconomic group are saying to themselves in their head, like, this is a way to differentiate? Or do you think it's more unconscious in that they don't even realize they're doing it?
I think for the most part, it is not conscious at all. I think that it's sort of akin to, there's the famous example from evolutionary biology of the peacock's tail. So the short version of this is that, peacocks display these very vibrant and colorful tail feathers to female peahens, as a way to advertise their fitness and their, whatever their genetic compatibility or whatever to these peahens. But these peacocks aren't like consciously going through the calculations of like, well, I have these very nice tail feathers, and if I show them to her and blah, 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 blah. That's not how it works. They are just like sort of pre-programmed to do this. Now, people don't come, pre-programmed with luxury beliefs. We're not born with, questioning monogamy or whatever. But every human, to some extent, is born with the sort of pre-conscious or, implicit desire to maintain and if we can, to increase our social status. And in our local environment, we will find ways to do that. Even if the specifics differ from culture to culture, person to person, and so on, we are sort of unconsciously aware, roughly, of like what our relative status is, and we tend to guard it fiercely, and then we tend to want to increase it. One of the more interesting findings along this vein is physical violence and homicides. So these two, I think they are either evolutionary psychologists or criminologists, but they're academic researchers in any case. Wilson and Daly found that a huge, substantial percentage of homicides. So most homicides are committed by young men, and most victims of homicide tend to be young men. And one shocking, finding from their work is that a lot of these homicides are from casual insults. These tend to be disputes over like a parking space, or, who gets to use this pool table at this bar at this particular night, or, someone insults someone's girlfriend. So these are kind of like, these aren't like incredibly high stakes events that they're fighting over. The sort of the material stakes of this are not that high to just let someone have a parking space. But what's going on beneath that is this, sort of incredibly powerful concern over our status, and to not let people get the better of us in those contests, and those quickly escalate into actual violence, oftentimes, at least in those circumstances. So, So to circle back to your question, I don't think that it's necessarily a conscious thing. It's very much implicit, and I don't think that. But on the other hand, I do think that a lot of people, they are aware of the fact that their ideas do have an outsized impact. But I think many of them think that it's for the good. And that's one of the reasons why I write about this, is to sort of point out that maybe your good intentions are not having the effect that you think.
What has been the response that you've gotten from your writing in general? Has it been positive? Has it been positive from certain types of people? Have you been able to trace the feedback to specific groups, socioeconomic groups?
Well, okay, so that's an interesting question. By and large, the people who tend to read, 3,000 word articles, they already disproportionately come from college educated backgrounds. So, the people who are reading my luxury beliefs articles, they tend to be, already educated. So I have gotten a couple of interesting emails from more working class people who've read these, and they enjoy it. But I don't know how representative that feedback is. On the other hand, I've gotten a lot of feedback from more sort of white collar educated types. And by and large, it's been positive. I've gotten some criticisms and critiques here and there. But one thing that surprised me, because I was actually nervous writing some of this, because I'm sort of making these, arguably, I'm just making these charges against an entire class of people. And, across the political spectrum, I found that people actually found this interesting. Maybe they didn't agree with all of it, but at the least they found it somewhat persuasive. And the biggest reaction I've gotten, honestly, overwhelmingly, it's been positive. The criticisms have been, fewer than the sort of compliments that I've received for this.
What are some of the typical negative responses or some of the criticisms of your work? Because I'm just curious.
Yeah. So for the luxury beliefs idea, a lot of people say that, you're only targeting sort of affluent bourgeois liberals. You're not, you're being sort of unfair and not also including, the sort of rich Republican conservative types too. But the thing is, none of my arguments in my essays were political. I never used the word liberal or conservative, or I tried to be apolitical in my observations. If it does come through that it seems to perhaps be more critical of well-to-do liberals, that's simply because they are the majority population at Ivy League universities. If you look at the statistics on this, professors at elite schools, it's something like 98% vote Democrat. The students, it's a little bit lower. It's around 90 to 93% of the students tend to lean left. So, that was just what I saw, right? Like, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who grew up the way that I grew up, literally was discharged from the military in August, started undergrad in September. And so to me, like, whatever that was, like that to me was like the sort of the upper class, upper middle class to upper class people. And I didn't even know at the time that I was making these observations and sort of started, sort of fleshing out this idea. I didn't even know like the politics of these places. So, as far as the criticisms go, they tend to have this political bent, but I certainly didn't mean to, necessarily target one side or the other.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any thesis or explanation for why schools in general, Ivy League schools, are so liberal? Have you thought about that at all?
I mean, I have. There have been some interesting, some interesting papers on this, some interesting ideas from Jonathan Haidt and others who have sort of, underlined the political disparities in higher education and university departments. I think, one reason could be, at least among the faculty, it could be that conservatives are just less interested in becoming professors, which is, perhaps plausible. Another is there could be some low-grade bias. There have been research studies suggesting that something like 80% of faculty members acknowledged that they would probably be biased if they were evaluating an application from someone of the opposite political party. So this wasn't just Democrat professors, but Republican professors too both said this. But the thing is, because the academic departments are already overwhelmingly Democrat, that bias will continue to tend to lead in one direction more so than the other. The students, I don't really know. I think part of it is just being young on average, regardless of your educational background or social class. Younger people tend to be more liberal. So even among like working class people, an 18-year-old is going to be more liberal in their attitudes than an 80-year-old working class person. But why it's so overwhelming, I don't quite understand. I think part of it, some of these students are actually more moderate or conservative in their views, but because there's this perception that, this is a liberal environment and you sort of have to express these views to sort of get by, that could be. Definitely one thing that I noticed was that, so in the military, so to back up, my adoptive mother and her partner, they were sort of like centrist Democrats. Voted for John Kerry. They voted for Obama in 2008. So that was sort of like the environment that I was in growing up. I was sort of like, I guess, a centrist too. But when I was in the military, I was sort of like designated the token liberal. A lot of my colleagues were much more to the right than I was. And I would be the guy to kind of like defend Obama or like defend Hillary Clinton, even if I didn't necessarily agree with everything they did. So I was like, okay, the token liberal. But then I get to Yale, and my views had not shifted at all. I was the same exact guy. And somehow, in classes or around, my peers, I suddenly became this token conservative.
Wow.
And so that's sort of, I guess, maybe as an indicator of like your environment kind of to some extent determines how your politics are viewed. So yeah, that just thought that might be interesting for discussion.
That is incredible. Like, you're the same person, or you believe you're the same person, and you have these beliefs and they don't change, but the environment changes, and the environment that really shows how centrist you really are, or maybe how much the environment is dictating and creating these environments and these secluded environments that don't really have other thought. What do you think is going on there?
Yeah. I mean, politics. So there is no like, I guess, firm definition of what's considered left, what's considered right. It changes over time. It's, whatever is considered conservative today may not have been considered conservative 20 years ago, or may not be considered conservative in 20 years. So
that's true.
The definitions can shift and change. And I think, depending on your environment, the sort of prevailing orthodoxy around you, that can sort of shift too. I mean, it was just, yeah, it was just an interesting experience that I had going from one environment to the other, and realizing, I mean, just sort of seeing how much, people's viewpoints can differ. And so so that was probably to some extent another influence on, the way my writings about class and about differences between, say, people who were highly educated and less educated, and political differences and so on.
What do you think would have happened if you put those students from Yale and those military in the same room together? What would have happened?
It's really funny. So I remember I was sitting in this class at Yale. This was an undergrad, and I don't remember how we came around to this discussion, but I told this story so it was a seminar of like 18 to 20 students. We're all around this table. And I told this story about how, I was talking with my college friend. So this is my friend of mine. He was at a different university, but he and I had met for dinner, and I was telling this story about to these young students. And I said, like, look, I was talking to my friend, and we were discussing, what we would want in our, future wives, who we'd want to marry and sort of settle down with, and what would be the ideal sort of characteristics. And both of us sort of concluded that, like, someone who'd be a good mom, and someone who would, sort of be good at her job, like someone who was, ambitious about her career, but at least enjoyed it. Was not a workaholic. That's what it was. She wasn't a workaholic. She enjoyed the job. She was ambitious, but she didn't let it sort of take over, because there's all these stories about burnout and work and so on. So those were the things: like your job, and sort of be a good parent, be a good mom. I told this story, and there was this quiet that came over the class, and the professor, who was, he was a great professor, one of my favorite professors from undergrad. He was he was good. And he said, like, so what do people think about this? And, immediately students started coming up and saying, like, there was just this sort of sexist undercurrent I felt in what you were saying, or, like this kind of, I just felt that, like, maybe you and your friend weren't viewing women as, complete people and just focusing on certain parts of them or whatever, personality. And I was just blown away by this. And this was, I think I was 2 years into Yale, so I was sort of used to it, and I did not expect that reaction. I thought I knew, like, how to express myself in a way that wouldn't ruffle too many feathers. And I just told the truth about what I was talking about with my friend, and they were acting this way. And I remember I told these students, I said, like, look, like, to be completely honest, like, if you could hear the conversations that, like, me and my military friends would have on a deployment about, like, sex or about women or about relationships, I mean, it's just a completely different world. Like, I'm not saying it's better or worse, or that it's okay or not okay. I'm just saying it's different. And, this idea that, like, me and this other, like this other student would talk this way about, I thought it was a very polite and quite a nice conversation, actually, given the way that, like, so many guys in their 20s talk about women. Mm-hmm. The fact that, like, he and I settled on, someone who likes her job and who'd be a good mom. Like, to me, that's, like, the most innocent response you could have to what you'd want in a partner. And so to get that reaction was just, to me, it was just kind of shocking. And so all of this is to say, to your question, like, I'm not sure what would happen, but it probably wouldn't be good. It's probably, it would be better, I think, if it was a one at a time thing, such that, like, if an Ivy League kid wants to meet some, what the military's like or what the culture, one go in there, sort of observe, hang back and see what it's like. But if they all sort of intermingled, I think it could turn into an argument.
Do you think that that's why there's such divide in the United States? It seems, from my perspective, that the United States is more divided today than it ever has been before. And I'm wondering if it's because the people in different classes could not even have a conversation and agree on the terms of the conversation. Do you think that has anything to do with the divide in the country?
Yeah. I mean, like, definitely there have been, a lot of interesting and interesting discussions and analysis of the class divide, the economic divide in our society. Yeah, I definitely think that that's part of it. I mean, white collar and blue collar America, I mean, like they live on, you know, they live in two different worlds, man. Like the way that the way that their families are, for example. I mean, one of the things that shocked me. So if you read, work from like Robert Putnam, political scientist at Harvard, or Charles Murray's a political scientist at AEI, like they've sort of documented how families have changed over time in the U.S. And so to just give some sense of this, like in 1960, affluent and working class families, in terms of divorce rates and marriage rates and whether children lived with both of their birth parents, were almost identical. So something like 95% of affluent white collar families, 95% of children were raised in a two-parent home in that social class. And for the blue collar working class environment, it was 85% of the children were raised in two-parent home with their birth parents. So, there was a little difference, but they were by and large, they were more similar than different. And then if you fast forward to 2005, the upper class white collar families, the number had dropped to 85%. So it was 95%, dropped to 85% for the affluent white collar families. But for the blue collar working class families, in 1960, it was 85%, and in 2005, it dropped to 30%. So the divergence was just massive, such that, affluent families today look about the same as they did. College-educated white-collar families look roughly the same as they did in the past, but blue-collar families look completely different. I think back to my high school friends, for example. There was a group of six of us, like sort of tight-knit group of six guys. None of us lived with both of our birth parents. So, it was me. I lived with my, adoptive mom and her partner, lived in a bunch of foster homes. Another of my friends, so I was actually just talking to another friend about this guy, but my friend, his father went to jail. His mother was a drug addict, and he was raised by his grandmother. And now, so currently he's in prison. And I was talking to another mutual friend of ours, and he reminded me of this joke from Chris Rock. It was something like, if a kid calls his grandmother mom and his mama Pam, then he's going to jail. And that's my friend. Like that's exact. And so, yeah. And that's pretty much what happened with my friend. That exact story. Another one of my friends, he lived with his dad who had been divorced 5 different times, only saw his mom like once a month. Another of my friends lived with his mom, a single mom, parents never married, his dad sort of in and out of jail. So that's sort of what life is like in sort of non-college educated, blue collar, working class communities. Like most kids don't, like if they know their dad, it's sort of like on and off basis. Usually their parents don't get married. It's just, yeah, versus like white collar communities. Yeah. So that's like one difference is the family. And I think I know that in polite society, a lot of the discussion has to do with economics, right? Like, oh, it's this economic inequality and that's sort of driving these, partisan disputes or, the sort of populist anger in the country. And I think there's some truth to that. There's probably some economic, undercurrent going on there. But I think a lot of it is also social and emotional, I don't know if this is the right word, but like spiritual, but just like this sort of vacancy or this emptiness among lower income people that isn't necessarily just to do with money alone, but with community, with family. I think there's a lot of sort of loneliness, which could also be driving these other effects. And I think some have speculated this too, or even found it to be the case in terms of drug addiction, opioid use, heroin addiction. There's a lot of stuff going on right now, and I don't think it can all be reduced to Andrew Yang's give everyone $1,000 a month, and people will feel better.
We're talking about so many different issues, right? And what you said in the beginning about how families were the same in 1985, not obviously the same, but similar in 1985, and now
1960.
they're in 1960 rather, and in 2005 they're vastly different. It reminds me of something Morgan Housel talks about in The Psychology of Money, which is that in 1960 everybody was watching the same programs, whether you were high on the socioeconomic ladder or middle class, working class, or blue collar or white collar. You were thinking in the same way because you're watching the same programs. He says like it was the Super Bowl every night. Everyone was watching the same thing, doing the same things, and that has diverged. And I just thought it was an interesting way to view the world. But at the same time, we view people's expectations for what they want in life have stayed the same, even though there's been vast differences in wealth. So kind of a similar idea, and just really interesting to think about.
Yeah. I think there have been a lot of these kinds of divergences. I mean, essentially, life used to be very, differences used to be more constrained in the past. Families looked quite similar, TV shows, hobbies, all of these kinds of things. The norms were roughly the same too, in terms of like, for example, norms about marriage, norms about child rearing, religious attendance too. There's an interesting finding that, I think so lower income Americans, I think they sort of express more religious belief in general compared to higher income. But in terms of who attends weekly religious services, that actually tends to be higher income people versus lower income people. So even like religious practices have diverged over time too. There is this sort of widening division, I think, which could be fueling, a lot of what we're seeing.
Very interesting. And so before we wrap this conversation up, I'd love to know what is something that you've changed your mind on in the past year, because you are such a well-read guy, it seems. You have so many different beliefs from so many different places, and I would love to know what is something that you believed last year that you no longer believe, or something you've changed your mind on.
So this is something that I tweeted this actually recently. I don't know if it counts necessarily as like changing my mind, but it's something that has come to my awareness that, maybe somewhat overturned what I used to think, which is basically that, there's this mistaken view, and I, to some extent, fell prey to this, that, if you read a popular book by a person in a specific field, it's very easy to think that like this person represents that field. Like that's how their colleagues are. They are the field. Like a simple example is like Stephen Hawking, right? Like he writes these very interesting popular science books, before he passed. And people think like that's what a physicist is like Stephen Hawking. He, probably that's what physicists are like. The thing is, and this goes to our earlier points about this sort of difference between, say, upper and lower class. If you write a book that appeals to wide swaths of the population, if you have sort of mainstream appeal, almost by definition, you are not representative of your field. If you're able to connect with ordinary people in that way, that suggests that you are much different than your colleagues. Mm. So, if you are so say if you want to work in a field, you read a popular book by an author, and then you think like, oh, like, okay, so that's what that's like. That's what these people are like. That's actually not true. So be careful. If you become interested in something because of a book you read, bear in mind that the author of that book, if it's a very popular book, they are not representative of the kinds of people you'd be working with later. Wow,
that's a very interesting insight. And I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to soak my mind with so many interesting topics. Tell everyone where they could find more if they want more Rob Henderson, and I'm sure they do after this conversation.
Yeah, you can just follow me on Twitter at Rob K. Henderson. I don't have a website or anything set up, but maybe soon.
Awesome. And that will be in the show notes at dannymiranda.com/podcast. Thank you, Rob, for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Danny.
Beautiful people, we are back. I just wanted to give you the proper outro you deserve. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know on Twitter at HeyDannyMiranda is the best place to find me. And I also wanted to let you know that Rob, he does have a website. You can check out his website at robkhenderson.com. And you definitely should, because this man is an incredible writer and he's got some great insights into our own psychology. All right, guys, thank you for listening until the final seconds. I appreciate you tremendously, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.